How does one measure the weight of a stone? You can place it on a scale, calculate its density, and arrive at a number, a fact as cold and hard as the object itself. But how does one measure the weight of a symbol? How do you quantify the hope that has been poured into it, the prayers that have clung to it like morning mist, the silent tears that have polished its surface more than any cloth? This was the question that echoed, unspoken, in the cavernous halls of the Oakhaven County Courthouse, a question that Judge Alastair Finch believed he had answered with the blunt instrument of the law. He was a man who lived by the tangible, the provable, the written statute. His world was one of paragraphs and precedents, a fortress of logic built brick by brick against the messy, unpredictable tides of human emotion, and, most especially, human faith. In his courtroom, there was no room for ghosts or gods, only the specter of reasonable doubt and the deity of established fact. The statue, a simple marble carving of the Virgin Mary, had stood in the courthouse rotunda for 70 years. It was a relic from a different time, a gift from a community of immigrant stonecutters who had helped build the very foundations of the city. To most, she was a silent, graceful fixture, a piece of local history. To some, she was a quiet source of comfort, a place to pause and find a breath of peace amidst the turmoil of legal battles. But to Judge Finch, she was an unconstitutional stain, a clear and present violation of the sacred separation of church and state. He saw her not as a mother of sorrows, but as a mother of all legal chaos, an effigy of belief in a temple dedicated to reason. And so he brought the gavel down. The sound, a sharp crack of wood on wood, was not merely a ruling, it was a declaration of war. A war on sentiment, on tradition, on the invisible threads of faith that bound the community together. In a voice stripped of all emotion, a voice that could dissect a legal argument with surgical precision, he ordered her removed. The words fell like stones into the stunned silence of the courtroom. This institution, he declared, his eyes sweeping over the packed benches, his gaze as unyielding as the granite pillars that held up the roof, is a bastion of secular justice. Its symbols must reflect its singular purpose. This effigy, regardless of its artistic merit or historical sentiment, represents a specific creed. Its continued presence is an endorsement, and this court endorses no faith but faith in the law itself. It will be removed within 48 hours. For Alastair Finch, this was more than a professional duty. It was a personal crusade. The man behind the black robe was a hollowed-out vessel, a man who had long ago traded wonder for certainty. There was a time, decades before, when he too had possessed a kind of faith. A desperate, pleading faith that had knelt at the bedside of a dying wife, a faith that had bargained with a silent heaven and received only silence in return. That silence had curdled into a hard, bitter certainty. The universe was a machine, indifferent and godless, and the only order to be found was the order that man imposed upon it through law. His grief had not softened him, it had calcified him. He had taken the emptiness within and projected it outward, seeking to scrub the world clean of the same false hopes that had once failed him so profoundly. He saw the statue's placid, downward gaze not as compassionate, but as condescending, a marble lie promising comfort where there was none to be had. The nation's media descended upon Oakhaven like a flock of crows, sensing a conflict that was perfectly packaged for primetime debate. It was the quintessential American drama, faith versus reason, tradition versus progress, the heart versus the mind. Judge Finch became an overnight icon for one side and a villain for the other. He accepted the role with a stoic, almost arrogant calm. He believed he was on the right side of history, a lonely sentinel guarding the high wall that kept superstition from flooding the pristine gardens of jurisprudence. He was certain. He was logical. He was in control. But what Judge Finch, in all his intellectual pride, failed to understand was that some things cannot be evicted by decree. He had passed judgment on a piece of stone, but in doing so he had inadvertently summoned a presence far older and more powerful than any law he had ever studied, a presence that did not argue or protest, but simply waited, with the patient, inexorable gravity of love itself, to present its own evidence. The battle for the Oakhaven courthouse was not to be fought with legal briefs and appeals. It was to be fought in the silent, unseen chambers of a single human heart. The town of Oakhaven did not erupt in fury. It fell into a state of collective, sorrowful prayer. The gavel's echo had barely faded from the marble halls before the people began to gather. They did not come with protest signs and angry chants, but with rosaries and candles. A quiet, resolute tide of humanity lapped at the courthouse steps, a testament to the fact that Judge Finch's ruling had not extinguished a fire, but had instead fanned 1,000 tiny flames into a single, defiant glow. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was thick with a tension that had nothing to do with pending litigation. The staff walked on eggshells, their hushed conversations clinging to the corners of the long, shadowy corridors. The empty pedestal where the statue would soon no longer stand seemed to be growing larger, a void that commanded more attention than the statue itself ever had. It was in this charged silence that Elena Reyes moved, a figure as constant and unassuming as the sunrise. For 30 years, she had been the courthouse's custodian, a woman whose stooped shoulders and calloused hands told a story of quiet, unwavering service. She was old, with a face like a roadmap of a long and difficult life, but her eyes held a clarity and a peace that belied her age. To her, the statue was not an object or a symbol of a creed. She was La Señora, the lady. Each night, long after the lawyers and clerks had gone home, Elena would complete her rounds, her final stop always being the rotunda. There, she would carefully, reverently, wipe the dust from the marble folds of the lady's robe and the serene contours of her face. It was a ritual of love, a silent conversation. On the night of Judge Finch's decree, Elena's movements were slower, more deliberate. She did not weep. Her faith was not the fragile, frantic kind that shattered in the face of adversity. It was a deep, ancient river, flowing steadily beneath the cracked surface of the world. After polishing the statue one last time, she reached into the pocket of her worn apron and pulled out a single, perfect white rose, its petals still holding the memory of the morning dew. She placed it at the statue's base, a solitary offering of beauty against the coming bleakness. A young, nervous bailiff, tasked with overseeing the initial preparations for the removal, watched her from the shadows. "It's a shame, Elena," he mumbled, his voice full of a sympathy he felt was inadequate. "Just following orders, you know." Elena turned, her dark eyes fixing on him not with anger, but with a profound, almost pitying sadness. "You can move the stone, son," she said, her voice a low, melodic whisper that seemed to carry the weight of generations. "But you cannot remove her presence. Some things have roots that do not grow in the ground." Her words hung in the air, a piece of simple, unvarnished prophecy that the young man would remember for the rest of his life. Meanwhile, miles away, in the sterile silence of his modernist home, Judge Alastair Finch poured himself a glass of expensive scotch. The house was a reflection of the man, all clean lines, hard surfaces, and a conspicuous absence of clutter or warmth. He stood before a vast plate-glass window, looking out at the city lights, feeling the satisfying hum of a battle won. On the television, a news anchor was discussing the Oakhaven controversy, showing images of the candlelight vigil. Finch let out a short, derisive laugh. He saw them as children, clinging to a fairy tale in the face of adult reality. He had done them a favor, he thought, by forcing them to confront the world as it truly was, a place governed by rules, not by miracles. He felt the cold, familiar satisfaction of being right, a feeling that had become the only source of comfort in his empty life. He drained his glass, the burn of the alcohol a welcome distraction from the persistent, low-grade ache of a loneliness he would never admit to. He was Judge Alastair Finch, a man of consequence, a man of ironclad reason. He was an island, impervious to the foolish tides of sentiment. He switched off the television, plunging the room into darkness, and in the sudden quiet, he felt a supreme, unassailable sense of order. He had restored the world, his world, to its proper balance. He had banished the divine. Or so he believed. But as the town prayed and the judge slept the sleep of the self-righteous, a fragrance was beginning to gather in the heart of the courthouse, a scent that owed nothing to any earthly flower, preparing to offer its own silent, irrefutable rebuttal. The first piece of evidence was submitted not to the court clerk, but to the senses of the judge himself. It was well past midnight. A storm had rolled in off the plains, and the rain beat a frantic, percussive rhythm against the tall, arched windows of Judge Finch's chambers. He often worked late, finding a perverse comfort in the solitude of the empty courthouse, a stone and steel kingdom where his word was absolute. He was poring over appellate briefs, his mind a finely tuned engine of logic, when it first reached him. A scent. It was faint at first, a mere suggestion, easily dismissed as a phantom of a tired mind. But it grew, blooming in the stale, book-dusted air of the room, until it was an undeniable, all-encompassing presence. It was the scent of roses. Not the cloying, artificial smell of an air freshener, nor the faint perfume of a passing secretary. This was something else entirely. It was a living scent, a fragrance so pure and complex it seemed to carry with it the coolness of the earth, the warmth of the sun, and the impossible sweetness of 1,000 blossoms opening at once. Judge Finch lowered his reading glasses. He sniffed the air, his brow furrowed in annoyance. He was a man who despised unaccountable variables. He got up and walked to the window, pressing his hand against the cold, damp glass. It was sealed tight, as it always was. He checked the vents of the building's ancient heating and cooling system. Nothing. He opened the heavy oak door to his chambers and peered into the darkened corridor. The air there was sterile, smelling only of floor wax and old paper. The scent was confined to his room, a fragrant, invisible cloud that had materialized from nowhere. He felt a prickle of unease, an unfamiliar sensation that he immediately suppressed with a wave of irritation. There had to be a logical explanation. There always was. Perhaps a cleaning crew had used a new polish. Perhaps someone had left a floral arrangement in a nearby office, and the scent had somehow, impossibly, seeped through the walls. He sat back down at his desk, determined to ignore it, to overpower this sensory anomaly with the sheer force of his intellect. But the fragrance would not be ignored. It seemed to seep into the very wood of his desk, into the leather of his chair, into the pages of the legal texts before him. It was a gentle, yet relentless, invasion. It was a scent that carried with it a memory he had long ago buried. The memory of his wife's funeral, of the suffocating profusion of lilies and roses that had filled the church, a smell he had associated ever since with the bitter impotence of prayer. But this was different. That long-ago scent had been one of death and decay, of flowers cut and dying. This scent was one of vibrant, impossible life. The more he tried to concentrate on the legal jargon in front of him, the more the aroma distracted and unsettled him. It felt like a presence in the room with him, a silent, fragrant observer. In the rotunda below, the lone white rose left by Elena sat at the base of the statue. In the dim security lighting, it seemed to glow with a soft luminescence of its own. The marble figure above it stood in its customary silence, its stone face a mask of serene neutrality. Yet the air around it was beginning to change. The cold, sterile atmosphere of the government building was being subtly transformed, charged with an unspoken potential, as if the very molecules in the air were holding their breath. Judge Finch, in his sealed chamber high above, felt an uncharacteristic urge to flee. He packed his briefcase with a sharp, angry efficiency, the scent of roses clinging to his clothes, his hair, his very skin. He strode through the empty halls, his footsteps echoing like gunshots in the profound silence. As he passed the rotunda, he deliberately averted his eyes from the statue, a childish act of defiance that surprised him. But he could not escape the scent. It seemed to follow him, a gentle, fragrant ghost, out into the rain-lashed night. As he drove home, with the sterile air of his luxury car blasting from the vents, he could still smell it. He had banished a statue of stone, but in its place, something intangible, something uncontainable had begun to rise. He had built his life on the solid ground of fact, but he was beginning to feel the first, terrifying tremors of a mystery that threatened to swallow him whole. The dawn broke gray and sullen, the sky bruised with the memory of the night's storm. For the small crowd of faithful huddled under umbrellas on the courthouse steps, it was a day of reckoning. A flatbed truck and a small crane had arrived, their diesel engines rumbling a discordant, mechanical hymn that grated against the quiet prayers of the vigil. The workers, a crew of grim-faced men in hard hats, moved with a reluctant professionalism. This was not a job any of them wanted. They were local men, men who had been baptized in the same churches as the people watching them, men whose own mothers and grandmothers likely had a small statue, just like this one on their dressers. But a job was a job, and the court's order was clear. Judge Finch watched the scene unfold from his chamber window, a cup of black coffee held tight in his hand. He had slept poorly, his dreams haunted by vast, formless gardens, and he had awoken to find the phantom scent of roses still clinging faintly to his pillows. He dismissed it as a psychosomatic reaction to the stress of the situation, a trick of an overwrought mind. Today, with the arrival of the crane and the crew, the situation would be resolved. The anomaly would be removed. The world would be set right. As the workers unfurled the heavy canvas straps and began to approach the statue, a sound began to fill the air. It was not the rumble of the truck or the murmur of the crowd. It was a sound that did not belong. It was the pure, resonant toll of a single massive bell. Dong. It was a sound of impossible clarity and depth, a bronze tone that vibrated not just in the ears, but deep in the chest. It was the sound of a great cathedral, a sound of ancient ceremony. Heads snapped up. The workers froze, their hands hovering over the straps. The crowd fell silent, their prayers cut short. Everyone heard it. Dong. It echoed through the rotunda, seeming to come from the very stones of the building itself. The chief of courthouse security barked into his radio, demanding a source. Was it a nearby church? A public announcement system malfunctioning? Reports came back, crackling with confusion. The nearest church with a bell of that size was St. Michael's, over a mile away, and its bells were silent, confirmed by a patrol car sent to check. There was no logical source for the sound. Dong. It was slow, deliberate, a rhythmic, solemn tolling. Judge Finch felt a jolt of cold adrenaline. He slammed his coffee cup down, spilling the hot liquid across a stack of legal documents. He stalked to his doorway, bellowing for his clerk. What is that noise? Find out what that noise is and make it stop. But no one could. The sound was everywhere and nowhere at once. It seemed to come from the sky, from the ground, from within the listener's own mind. And then, the moment one of the workers, under the shouted, frustrated orders of his foreman, finally touched the statue, laying a hand on the cool marble shoulder to guide a strap, the bell stopped. The silence it left behind was more profound, more deafening, than the sound itself. Everyone stood frozen, caught in a shared moment of inexplicable awe. Later that morning, Chief Justice Marcus Thorne paid a visit to Finch's chambers. Thorne was a pragmatist, a political animal who understood the delicate dance between law and public opinion. He had initially, if quietly, supported Finch's ruling on principle, but the escalating spectacle was making him nervous. "Alistair," he began, foregoing the usual pleasantries as he sank into a leather chair opposite Finch's desk. "This is turning into a circus. The national news is running stories about weeping statues and phantom bells." Finch stiffened, his face a mask of rigid denial. It was a sound system malfunction. A prank. Condensation on the marble. There are a dozen rational explanations, Marcus. Thorne leaned forward, his expression serious. Maybe. But perception is reality in the court of public opinion. The optics are a nightmare. I've had calls from the governor's office. People are unsettled. A group of courthouse employees is refusing to participate in the removal. They're saying the building is haunted. Finch slammed his hand on the desk. This is absurd. It's mass hysteria, fueled by superstition and a sensationalist media. It's a piece of stone, Marcus. A piece of stone. But his voice lacked its usual commanding certainty. There was a tremor of something else in it, a frantic edge of a man trying to convince himself as much as his audience. Thorne sighed, running a hand over his tired face. All I'm saying is be careful. Is this really a hill you want to die on? There are ways to walk this back, to compromise. Let a historical society take it. Move it to a less prominent location. But for Alistair Finch, it was too late for compromise. His pride was now inextricably bound to the fate of the statue. To retreat now would be to admit defeat, not just to the protesters and the media, but to the creeping, irrational doubt that was beginning to erode the very foundations of his own mind. He would not be intimidated by phantom noises or mass delusion. He would see this through. He would impose order. That night, sleep offered no escape for Judge Finch. It became a new courtroom, a new theater for a trial in which he was no longer the presiding authority. He resisted it at first, working until his eyes burned, attempting to exhaust his mind into a state of dreamless oblivion. He finally succumbed in the cold, early hours of the morning, collapsing into a fitful slumber in his high-backed leather chair, the unread pages of a legal precedent resting on his chest. And then he was no longer there. The oppressive weight of his office, the scent of old paper and his own anxiety, all of it dissolved. He found himself standing in a place he had never been, yet one that felt impossibly, achingly familiar. He was in a garden. A vast, endless garden that stretched in every direction under a canopy of stars so bright and numerous they looked like diamond dust spilled on black velvet. There was no moon, yet the landscape was bathed in a soft, silvery light that seemed to emanate from the flowers themselves. And the flowers were all roses. Millions upon millions of them. White roses, their petals curled like sleeping children's fists, glowing with a gentle, internal luminescence. The air was cool and sweet, and the silence was not an absence of sound, but a presence. It was a silence that was full, resonant, and alive. It was the silence of perfect peace. All the tension that had been coiled in his shoulders for decades, all the brittle anger and the deep, abiding grief, it all began to unspool. He felt a sense of calm so profound it was terrifying. It was an undoing. In his waking life, peace was the absence of conflict. Here it was an active, benevolent force. He began to walk, his feet making no sound on the soft, grassy path. He was not guiding his own steps. He felt drawn, pulled gently forward by an unseen current. In the distance he saw a figure. It was a woman, her back to him, robed in a blue so deep it seemed to have been cut from the night sky itself. She was not idle. She was tending the roses, her movements slow, graceful, and infinitely patient. She moved from blossom to blossom, not pruning or cutting, but simply touching them, her presence seeming to make them glow all the brighter. He knew, with a certainty that bypassed all logic, who she was. Yet there was no fear. He felt an overwhelming urge to call out to her, to demand answers, to rage at her for the silence that had met his prayers all those years ago. He wanted to ask her where she had been when his wife was gasping for her last breath, where this peace was when his own world had shattered into a million irreparable pieces. But the words would not form. The rage, which had been his constant companion for so long, had no power here. It was like shouting into a vacuum. The anger was his, a poison he had been carrying, but it had no place in this garden. It was a foreign language. The figure never turned. She never acknowledged his presence. And yet, he felt seen. He felt known, in a way that was more complete and more intimate than any human gaze. He felt the totality of his life, his bitterness, his pride, his hidden sorrow, his small, forgotten acts of kindness, all of it held in a state of unconditional, non-judgmental acceptance. It was not forgiveness, for that would imply a verdict had been passed. It was something more fundamental. It was a love that simply was like the light from the stars, asking for nothing in return. He felt the hard shell he had built around his heart begin to crack, not from a forceful blow, but from a gentle, persistent pressure from within. He felt a stinging in his eyes, a sensation so foreign he barely recognized it. It was the prelude to tears. And then he woke up. He was back in his chair, the harsh fluorescent light of his office buzzing overhead. The room was cold, but the peace of the garden lingered, a faint, ghostly echo. And the scent of roses, stronger and more vivid than ever before, was all around him. He sat there for a long time, the unread legal document on the floor at his feet, as the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the window. For the first time in 30 years, Judge Alastair Finch did not know what to believe. The solid ground of his certainty had been replaced by a terrifying, beautiful, and bottomless abyss. Pride is a formidable fortress. Even when its foundations are cracked and its walls are breached, it will command its defenders to fight to the last man. For Judge Alastair Finch, the experiences of the last 48 hours, the scent, the bell, the dream, were assaults on the very citadel of his identity. He could not reconcile them with the world he knew, and so he chose to deny them. He interpreted his dream as a hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep. He doubled down on his conviction that the bell and the scent were elaborate, malicious pranks orchestrated by his opponents. The more the world tilted towards the miraculous, the more fiercely he clung to the mundane. He would not be made a fool of. He would not be defeated by shadows and whispers. He arrived at the courthouse that morning with a grim, warrior-like resolve. He had called the chief of police and demanded a security perimeter. He had instructed the work crew that there would be no more delays, no more hesitation. The statue would be removed today, under his direct, personal supervision, in the full light of day, where there could be no tricks, no illusions. He would stand there himself and watch the offending object be lifted from its place, and in its physical removal, he would find a validation of his own fracturing reality. The scene at the courthouse was a media spectacle. Cameras were perched on every available surface, their lenses like the unblinking eyes of a dozen cyclopes. The crowd of onlookers had swelled, a sea of solemn, watchful faces. Elena was there, standing near the front, her rosary beads moving silently through her gnarled fingers. She was not looking at the crane or the workers, but at Judge Finch, who stood on the top step, his arms crossed, his face a granite mask of authority. A strange weather phenomenon began to manifest. Though the forecast had been for clear skies, the heavens directly above the courthouse began to curdle. Dark, bruised-looking clouds swirled into a vortex, and a raw, cold wind began to whip through the square, tearing at flags and rattling the old windows of the building. Yet it was a localized storm. A few blocks away, the sun was shining. The meteorologists, broadcasting live, stammered in confusion, calling it a microcell of unprecedented and inexplicable behavior. But directly over the rotunda's large skylight, in the eye of this miniature hurricane, was a perfect circle of calm, blue sky. It was a hole in the heavens, a celestial spotlight illuminating the drama below. The workers, unnerved by the wind and the charged atmosphere, moved with a grim haste. They attached the heavy canvas straps around the body of the statue, the thick fabric looking like a vulgar restraint on the figure's graceful form. The crane's engine groaned as the winch began to tighten, the thick steel cable growing taut. The crowd held a collective breath. The marble figure, which had stood in silent stillness for 70 years, was about to be uprooted. As the first strain was taken, and the base of the statue began to shift with a faint, grating sound, a single woman in the crowd cried out, pointing a trembling finger. "Look! Look at her face!" All eyes, including the unblinking eyes of the cameras, zoomed in. From the corner of the statue's right eye, a single, glistening drop of moisture was emerging. It caught the strange light from the sky above, sparkling like a diamond. It welled up, held for a moment on the smooth curve of the marble cheek, and then traced a slow, deliberate path downward. Then another formed in the left eye. The statue, a piece of inanimate, porous rock, was weeping. The hardened construction foreman, a man who had seen everything on job sites from industrial accidents to fistfights, simply stared, his mouth agape. One of his youngest crew members made the sign of the cross, his face pale with shock. The whisper rippled through the crowd, growing into a murmur, a stunned, awe-filled chorus. "She's weeping. My God, she's weeping." Judge Finch saw it. He saw it with his own eyes, and he saw it magnified on the large television screen of a news van. He felt a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. It was a trick. It had to be a trick. A pipe in the ceiling, a chemical reaction, a clever device planted in the night. It was an attack, a personal, insidious attack on his sanity. The last vestiges of his composure shattered. The fortress of his pride made its final, desperate stand. "Proceed." The voice that tore from Judge Finch's throat was unrecognizable, a raw, ragged sound of a man at the very edge of his own sanity. "I said proceed. It's a trick. Lift it now." His shout was a command born of sheer terror, the terror of a man watching the entire architecture of his life, his beliefs, and his reason collapse into dust. The crane operator, his face ashen, hesitated. The foreman stood frozen, looking from the weeping statue to the raging judge, caught between a court order and what felt like a command from heaven itself. The crowd began to pray aloud, the sound of 100 Hail Marys rising to meet the howling wind. This defiance, this collective rejection of his authority, was the final straw. Finch would prove it. He would expose the fraud with his own 2 hands. He stormed down the courthouse steps, pushing through the stunned security guards, his black robe billowing behind him like the wings of a vengeful angel. He marched directly to the statue, his eyes burning with a zealot's fire. He was a man possessed, not by a demon, but by a desperate, dying rationalism. "It's condensation," he yelled, his voice cracking, trying to convince the world, trying to convince himself. "It's a flaw in the stone." He reached the statue, a maelstrom of wind, prayer, and flashing cameras swirling around him. He raised a trembling hand, his finger pointing at the glistening tear track on the marble face. He was going to touch it, to smear it, to show everyone that it was just water, just a physical substance with a physical explanation. He was going to wipe the miracle away. His fingertip, cold and numb, made contact with the statue's cheek. And in that infinitesimal moment of contact, the world ceased to exist. The wind stopped. The roar of the crowd vanished. The flash of the cameras went dark. All sensory input was gone, replaced by an absolute, profound, and holy silence. It was the silence of the garden from his dream, but this time it was not a dream. It was more real than anything he had ever experienced. In that silence, he felt a presence. It was not a voice that spoke in words, but a wave of pure, unadulterated love that washed over him, through him, dismantling him piece by piece. It was the benevolent mother. She did not accuse. She did not judge. She simply held him in a gaze that was not of the eyes, but of the soul. In that loving silence, he was shown everything. He saw his life not as a series of events, but as a map of his own heart. He saw the vibrant, joyful boy he had once been. He saw the depth of his love for his wife, a love he had tried to bury under layers of bitterness. He saw the moment her death had become a seed of anger, a seed he had nurtured and watered with pride and intellectual arrogance until it had grown into a thorny, impenetrable fortress that kept everyone and everything out. He saw his loneliness, not as a state of being, but as a choice he had remade every single day. He saw his crusade against the statue for what it truly was, a pathetic, desperate war against his own pain. He felt the weight of his grief, a weight he had carried for 30 years, and in that moment, the presence gently, lovingly lifted it from him. The fortress walls did not just crumble, they dissolved into light. And what was left in their place was not a void, but an ocean of mercy. The tears that had been frozen inside him for decades began to thaw. The real world rushed back in. The wind, the cameras, the crowd. They saw Judge Alastair Finch, the man of iron and law, standing with his hand pressed to the face of the statue. And they saw him weeping. Not the single, pristine tear of the marble, but a flood of raw, broken, human sobs. He sank to his knees on the cold granite, his whole body shaking with the force of a lifetime of unshed grief. The crowd fell into a stunned, breathless silence. The only sound was the judge's ragged weeping. Then, through his tears, he whispered a single, world-altering word, a word of command that was also a word of total surrender. "Stop!" The word, though barely a whisper, carried with it the force of a thunderclap. It cut through the tension, through the supernatural wind, and brought the entire spectacle to a halt. The crane operator immediately killed the engine. The foreman signaled his men to stand down. The media held their cameras steady, capturing a scene that was far more powerful than the one they had come for. The miracle was no longer a weeping statue. It was a weeping judge. Judge Alastair Finch remained on his knees for a long time, his hands still resting on the statue's base, his head bowed. He was not praying, not in the traditional sense. He was simply breathing in the ruins of his former self, feeling the clean, sharp air of a new and terrifying freedom. His security detail, recovering from their shock, moved to help him, but he waved them away with a gentle, dismissive gesture. When he finally rose to his feet, he was a different man. The hard, arrogant lines of his face had softened. The cold, analytical light in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, sorrowful, and profoundly humbled wisdom. He turned to face the crowd and the cameras, not with a prepared statement, but with the raw, unscripted truth of a soul laid bare. The press conference he gave later that day was unlike any in the nation's history. He did not speak of legal precedent or constitutional law. He did not attempt to explain the weeping stone or the phantom bell. He stood at the podium, his voice quiet and steady, and he spoke of the human heart. "There are laws," he began, his eyes scanning the faces of the stunned reporters, "that are not written in books. There are truths that cannot be proven with evidence. I have spent my life in service to the written law, and I believed it to be the highest, most noble order to which we could aspire. I was wrong." He paused, and the only sound in the room was the frantic clicking of cameras. An order that does not make room for mercy, for mystery, for the undeniable jurisdiction of love, is no order at all. It is a cage. My ruling was legally sound, but my heart was in error. I hereby rescind my order. The statue will remain. His transformation was absolute and undeniable. He did not offer excuses or convoluted explanations. He offered a confession. He had been a man blinded by his own grief and pride, and he had been granted a moment of sight. The story exploded across the country, stunning the nation as the headlines had promised. It was a narrative that defied easy categorization. It was not a simple victory for faith over secularism. It was a story of a man's profound, personal, and public transformation. The debate shows and opinion columns didn't know what to do with it. Skeptics tried to debunk the phenomena, proposing elaborate theories of ultrasonic frequencies and geological water seepage, but their explanations felt thin and hollow next to the raw, emotional power of the judge's conversion. The town of Oakhaven, which had been the epicenter of a national conflict, became a place of quiet wonder. The crowds did not gloat, they prayed. The courthouse square was no longer a site of protest, but one of pilgrimage. People came to see the statue, now affectionately known as Our Lady of the Courthouse, and to leave their own flowers at its base. That evening, as the news crews packed up their equipment and the last of the pilgrims departed, Elena made her usual rounds. She moved through the now silent courthouse, her bucket and mop seeming like holy implements in the reverent quiet. She reached the rotunda and saw Judge Finch standing before the statue, not as a judge, but as a simple man. He was no longer looking at it as a legal problem to be solved, but with an expression of quiet gratitude. He turned as he heard her approach. Their eyes met across the marble floor. No words were exchanged. None were needed. In that shared gaze, there was a perfect, silent understanding. Elena simply smiled, a small, knowing smile, and placed her fresh, single white rose next to the dozens of others that now carpeted the statue's base. The law had been served, but a higher law had prevailed. The story of Judge Finch and the weeping statue did not end when the cameras left. A true transformation is not a singular event, but the beginning of a new way of living. For Alastair Finch, the climactic encounter in the courthouse square was a death and a rebirth. He did not abandon the law. In fact, he dedicated himself to it with a renewed and transfigured purpose. The black robe, which had once been his armor, became a mantle of responsibility, a reminder not of his power, but of his profound duty to wield that power with compassion. He became known in legal circles as a different kind of judge. His legendary intellectual rigor was still present, but it was now tempered with a deep and abiding humility. He began to listen more, not just to the arguments of the lawyers, but to the human stories that flickered behind the defendant's eyes. He looked for the mitigating circumstances, the hidden wounds, the silent griefs that so often led people to his courtroom. His rulings, once famous for their cold, incisive logic, became renowned for their creative and merciful wisdom. He pioneered restorative justice programs in his district, bringing victims and offenders together not for retribution, but for the difficult, holy work of reconciliation. Some of his old colleagues whispered that he had gone soft, that his encounter had unhinged him. But those who appeared before him, the frightened, the broken, and the guilty, found that his courtroom was no longer just a place of judgment, but a place where a sliver of grace was possible. The Oakhaven County Courthouse itself was subtly changed. It remained a functioning government building, but it had also become something more. The statue in the rotunda was now a permanent, celebrated fixture. A small, discreet plaque was installed, telling the official, sanitized version of the story, but the real story was told in the whispers of the security guards and the janitors, in the way lawyers would pause for a moment before the statue on their way to a difficult trial. It became a local legend, a modern parable that parents told their children. It was a story about how the heart of their city was saved not by a legal victory, but by a mystery. The ripple effect extended far beyond the courthouse walls. The story became a source of hope and wonder for millions. It was a powerful counter-narrative to a world that often felt cynical and godless. It suggested that the universe was not, perhaps, a cold and indifferent machine after all. It hinted at a love that was patient, a mercy that was persistent, and a presence that was willing to meet us in the most unlikely of places, not just in a church or on a mountaintop, but in the sterile, marble halls of human bureaucracy. The moral of the story, as it settled into the collective consciousness, was not about the triumph of one religion over another. It was about the triumph of humility over pride. The true miracle was not the inexplicable scent of roses, the phantom tolling of a bell, or even the impossible tears on a stone face. The true miracle was the radical, foundational transformation of a single, hardened human heart. It was a testament to the idea that no one is beyond the reach of grace, that no wall of grief is too thick to be penetrated by a quiet, persistent love. The story of Judge Finch served as a permanent reminder that the most profound verdicts are not those handed down from a judge's bench, but those that occur in the silent, contested courtroom of the soul, where the only thing that can overcome the stubborn evidence of our own pain is the irrefutable testimony of a love that defies all explanation. The legacy of that single, tumultuous week in Oakhaven became etched into the fabric of American folklore. It was a story that possessed the timeless quality of a myth, a modern parable that spoke to a deep and universal human longing for meaning beyond the material world. The symbols of the event took on a life of their own. The rose became a shorthand for a love that could bloom in the most barren of places. The bell became a metaphor for the wake-up calls that life issues to a slumbering soul. The tears, both of the statue and the judge, became a sacred symbol of a shared sorrow between the divine and the human, a merging of heaven's grief and earth's pain that results in the cleansing water of mercy. The light, that impossible column of sunlight in the midst of a storm, was remembered as a sign of clarity, the focused, unwavering attention of a higher power that can pierce through the darkest clouds of our own confusion. Judge Alastair Finch lived for another 20 years, and he never once wavered from the path he had found that day. He never became a preacher or a proselytizer. He remained a man of the law, a quiet, thoughtful jurist. When asked directly about the events, which he often was by curious journalists and spiritual seekers, he would simply smile and say, "I was presented with evidence that was irrefutable, and I had no choice but to change my verdict." He wrote no books and gave no grand speeches. His testimony was his life. His compassion became his doctrine, his mercy his liturgy. He mended the broken relationship with his own past, visiting his wife's grave not with anger, but with a quiet sense of peace, often leaving a single white rose on the headstone. He had learned that love does not end with death, and that silence is not always a sign of absence. The courthouse remained a place of quiet wonder, a landmark of the heart. The statue of the Virgin Mary, standing serene amidst the daily chaos of human law, served as a constant, silent reminder. A reminder that beneath the surface of our well-ordered, rational world, there is a deeper current, a hidden spring of mystery and grace. It reminded all who saw it that faith is not the absence of doubt, but the courage to act in the face of it, and that the most powerful force in the universe is not an earthquake or a hurricane, but a quiet, persistent, and unconditional love that waits patiently for us to simply stop and listen. The story of Judge Finch and the statue is a testament to the idea that no heart is so thoroughly barricaded by pride, no mind so completely sealed by cynicism, that it cannot be opened by a touch of the divine. It is a story for the skeptic, for the grieving, for the lost. It suggests that our most profound transformations often begin at the very moment we are most certain, the moment we believe we have everything figured out. It is in that moment of absolute, ironclad pride that we are most vulnerable to the shattering, beautiful, life-altering power of a mystery we can never hope to solve. The final judgment was not on a piece of stone, but on a way of seeing the world. And the final verdict was, and always will be, love. The story of Judge Finch is more than a headline. It is a mirror. It reflects the courthouses we build within our own hearts, the rigid laws of pride and grief we impose upon ourselves. It forces us to ask, what statues have we ordered removed from our lives? What sources of wonder, mystery, and grace have we deemed inadmissible, ruling them out of order in the name of logic and self-preservation? We all have our own fortresses of certainty, walls we construct from our pain, our education, and our fear of the unknown. We appoint ourselves the sole judge of our own reality, bringing down the gavel on anything that challenges our narrow view of the world. But this story whispers a profound truth, that just outside the walls of our self-imposed courtroom, a patient, loving presence is always waiting. It does not argue its case with loud proclamations or overwhelming force. It communicates through the unexpected scent of a forgotten memory, the clear, resonant bell of a sudden insight, the tearful crack in our own hardened facade. It asks only for a moment of surrender, a willingness to entertain evidence that our senses cannot measure and our minds cannot comprehend. It asks us to be open to the possibility that the greatest strength is not found in rigid control, but in a humble, open-hearted questioning. The most important battles are not fought in the public square, but in the silent chambers of the soul. If you were moved by this story of profound transformation and the quiet power of faith that waits for us all, please consider liking this video, subscribing to our channel, and sharing this message of hope with someone who might need to hear it. For in every human heart, there is a courtroom where pride and mercy stand in judgment, and sometimes the greatest verdict is to simply be still and to allow for a divine appeal.